Hey everybody, Mr. Wagstaff here. Cool stuff to talk about. Alright, we're starting a new unit here on the Revolution, meaning the American Revolution. The way this is going to start, we are going to start in history telling this story with the colonies, 13 colonies. Everything is going good. By the end of this unit, we have George Washington as the first president, Constitution is in place, and America exists and is starting on its path to the rest of this course. So, what this unit is going to be talking about is the Revolution and the gradual process up to what will be the Revolutionary War. What we'll start talking about today specifically is the growing culture that is starting between England and the colonies. So, while England is 4,000 miles away, fully expecting that the colonies are just doing everything they're supposed to, and for the most part the colonies are, they just assume the colonies are happy to be there, and the colonies' only goal in life is to serve England, which is the concept of mercantilism. What England is not aware of is a bunch of things have been happening for a couple hundred years at this point that is creating a completely unique identity in the colonists, a completely unique culture in the colonies that is different than England. Now, none of that is a problem for either side as long as the colonists are still getting what they want from England and England is getting what they want from the colonists. England, what do they want from the colonists? Money. Keep sending us stuff and let us rip you off. The colonists, completely aware they're getting ripped off by sending them stuff like tobacco, they're fine with it as long as England leaves them alone and lets them do whatever they want. Until that status quo gets challenged, everything's going to be fine. We're going to start talking about today how that status quo will get challenged and or the culture that's going to be created in which once that status quo is challenged, why the colonists are willing to fight the most powerful country on earth. Keep in mind, England is the most powerful country on earth at the time, and the colonies have the military prowess of your hometown. All right, so England would be like present day. The colonists is like your hometown, and England would be the American military. There is 0% chance that any type of military action against England should have been successful, but it is going to be, and we're going to talk about in detail why that is. But again, today, as we start just with this specific lesson, we're going to talk about the growing culture and ideological changes that are taking place in the colonies that England is oblivious to. All right. So let me make myself here small, put myself up here in the corner. All right, so this unit's called the Revolution. This is a picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware famously in 1776. We'll get to that in future lessons. All right, so how did the American Revolution work? What we're specifically talking about here is how in the world were the colonists, how did they even comprehend the idea that we want to be independent? That just seems like a crazy idea up to this point. Because England controlled the colonies in theory, and we'll talk about in theory, the idea that these colonies would be able to create their own country and run themselves is crazy talk in other places around the world because colonies don't have the ability to rule themselves. But spoiler alert, the colonies are going to be very successful ruling themselves. This is what the United States of America will become. So how did that happen? And so here's a little review, I guess, little of what we talked about some in the last unit of the differences in the colonies here in the New World, the English colonies, as opposed to a lot of the other colonies around the world. Number one, the House of Burgesses. This is an example that England didn't really control day-to-day life in the colonies. They let the colonists run themselves. So the House of Burgesses, which was in Virginia, which was basically like a democratic elected group that ruled themselves, we being the United States of America, or the colonies I should say, had already had experience ruling themselves in a very functioning, the people lead type system. Most colonies don't have that around the world. The Mayflower Compact, completely separate from the House of Burgesses, means a whole separate group of people that are, I don't want to call them religious fanatics because that sounds really bad, but the Pilgrims and Puritans when they show up, they create constitutions. This is the Mayflower Compact right here that gets made, showing that there is a overwhelming desire by people all across the colonies to use a democracy and rule themselves. So from the beginning, I mean, before the people in the Mayflower, before the Pilgrims got off the ship, they were already having this idea of being able to rule themselves and holding themselves accountable by their own standards that they create. This type of stuff isn't common among colonies around the world. Typically, the mother country would be the one that enforced laws and the colonies followed it. In the colonies, they make their own laws. So here's another one. We talked about in the previous unit, the different religions that took place. Pilgrims and Puritans splitting hairs. And yes, there's stuff like Maryland that had the Act of Toleration. That's like death to anybody that's not Christian. But if you're Christian, we're cool with you. Outside of things like that, you have like the middle colonies that had all types of Jewish people, atheists, agnostics, people that don't go to church at all. That you have all types of people that lived here in harmony in the middle colonies, proving that you can have a society with a whole bunch of different groups and get along fine. So that is another example of how the colonies are able to deal with adversity and create a government that works for everybody. Here's a big reason why the colonies were kind of forced to do that. As opposed to being some of the African colonies that England probably owned, over here from Charleston, South Carolina to England, probably London, is a little north of London there, is 4,000 miles. England, even if they wanted to micromanage, they're just not going to be able to. So England has to take a hands-off approach, and the colonies, since they keep shipping over their supplies, England just assumes it goes well. For the most part, it does. All right? So the general status quo here, you send England your stuff, if you're the colonies, and England leaves you alone. The colonists came to the New World to start over and be separate from England, to do their own thing. England leaves the colonists alone. England wants stuff from the colonies. Colonies send stuff, everybody gets along. Until that status quo gets changed, everything's going to be fine. There were also some new ideas that were coming out. I use this picture here. It's just a picture of the Enlightenment that we'll talk about here in a minute more in detail. The Enlightenment kind of changes the way people were thinking about how society should work, which is going to have some negative consequences for the King of England. There's also something that's going to take place in the United States, in the colonies at the time, called the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening means everybody gets more Jesus in their life. That the Christian religion drastically takes off, and there's a more of a fundamentalist takeoff of the Christian religion. This is actually also not going to be good for England as far as the cultural change that's going to happen in the colonies. And we'll talk about why here in a minute. So the question is, why did the Americans feel confident that they could lead their own country and did not need England anymore? Well, we have talked about this quite a bit, and you could probably go ahead and answer this, but I want to clarify this here on this first question, because this is the backbone concept that we're going to build off of as we go through. America didn't feel like they needed England because they hadn't been using England. They'd already been ruling themselves. England wasn't necessary. All they wanted to do was live their life and be left alone. Even if that means getting ripped off by England, all right? We'll deal with it, all right? So the Americans, the colonists, we'll call them Americans, feel confident if England just like poof disappeared, we'd be fine. We'd been ruling ourselves for a long time, all right? England, in no way, shape, or form, believes that the colonists can survive on their own. There is no comprehension of how confident the colonists would be if England wasn't there to take care of them, even though England hasn't been doing anything for a very long time. All right, so always make sure you get 2 complete sentences on these. Pause me if you need to. I'm a video, so you can pause me. And I'll keep a cool stance so you can pause me. All right, so pause me, answer them, and then go on. Most of these, I'm not going to stop on the question and answer them. I'm just going to be answering them as I talk through them. I'll have them in the PowerPoints, but that way it just registers with me to make sure I discussed it correctly. All right. So the Enlightenment. This is big time. So you may have heard of this story, all right? There's this dude named Isaac Newton, all right? Now this is back, we're going back a little bit in history at this point, from the colonial times. So Isaac Newton discovers gravity. So the story is he was sitting under a tree, an apple fell and hit him, and he's like, gravity. Isaac Newton's a genius, to put it mildly. In his spare time, he creates calculus. I mean, didn't learn calculus, made it. So he's smart. So it may seem odd to think, like, what do you mean he discovered gravity? He's like, hey, there's something that makes stuff fall down, and comes up with all these math equations to prove it, like stuff falls down. Since you've always experienced it, you may not, people don't question it. The reason that's important for the colonies, that he discovered gravity, it wasn't like the colonists were like, oh, we can use gravity now for independence. No, it's much more deeper and concept-like as you move forward with the idea of him discovering gravity. So gravity has always been here. And then all of a sudden, I mean, how long have humans existed? Millions of years, depending on where you want to start the beginning of time with Lucy. So the idea of gravity is extremely important because there's been something here that's been here forever, and then all of a sudden we discover it, something that has affected all of our lives. The reason that's important is during the Enlightenment, it means you start looking at things that have always existed, that have always been there, and you start looking around in your life and you're like, why is that there? Is that the best way of doing things? Can we do things better? Enlightenment just becomes a time period where people start valuing questions. So you start questioning things, right? And you're like, why is this happening? Where is this coming from? Is this the best way of doing it? Once people start questioning things, this isn't necessarily going to be good for the kings, especially as far as the colonists are concerned with England, with the king in England. So the reason the king is the king, all right, is not just because he got really lucky to being born to the previous king, which is exactly what happens. The reason everybody follows the king is because there is a belief that God put him there, that he is divine or holy or more than human, and that God put him there, and there is no way the king can make a bad decision because God put him there. That is how kings have kept power, is I am part God. Oh, let me rephrase that God wanted me here. I am God's chosen person to lead, so that's why you have to listen to me. And that's why nobody questioned the king. Once the Enlightenment came out, people were like, wait a minute. What if that's just a dude? That's just a guy that got real lucky to being born to the right family, and he's not anything special. Once that takes hold in people's minds, and that's what the Enlightenment does, it starts making people realize the king isn't special. He's not a special human. He's just another person. Once they start realizing that the king is just another guy, then the specialness of the king goes away. Once he is no longer like God chosen and that belief goes away, then he's not perfect and he can make mistakes. Once you acknowledge that the king can make mistakes, you start realizing maybe there's something better than the king. Maybe there's a better idea than the king. Maybe the king doesn't always have the best ideas. So the Enlightenment makes people question the divinity of the king, means like the God appointedness of the king, and start realizing, all right, so if this is just a dude, maybe that's not the best way of doing things. Maybe we can do things better, all right? So the question is, why is it important in American history when the colonists started to question the divinity of the king in England? Everything gets thrown out the window at that point. Once you start questioning him, all of a sudden, it's an open book. You can do whatever you want as far as a government is concerned over what's best for your society. Because prior to that, when God was in charge, all right, nobody questioned the king. Once the Enlightenment comes out, people started using logic and reason to question things, and they start questioning the king. There ends up being this epiphany, and you're like, we can do things better. All right? So, very important in the American colonies that they stop viewing the king as a godlike figure. So pause me if you need to, answer these in 2 sentences, and we're going to move on. All right. So there's some really important thinkers that come out at the time during the Enlightenment. Now, these guys, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu, all right, and I'm going to go through and talk about each one of these guys here. They are going to be crazy famous. Eventually, when America creates our Constitution, we are going to pull heavily from John Locke, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. What's interesting is when these guys were alive, all right, so they were alive about 100 years before, or we'll say 60, 70 years before the Constitution gets built, all right? Some of them died right before or after, but whatever. By the time the Constitution gets written, they're dead. Most of these guys lived horrible lives, all right? They were not famous at all. They were just thinkers. They wrote books. Nobody's going to read them. So a lot of these guys are super, like, not known. They're just guys that write really smart books. Nobody reads them. Read them. The people who did read them was usually the government, and since these guys question the way the government is run, they usually have to like flee for their lives for the rest of their life once they write these books, or they just or live in obscurity and nobody knows about them, and then they die poor and unknown. But then the reason these guys are so famous, and they're making it right now, is when they're alive they are not famous. There ends up being people like Thomas Jefferson who come out and read these guys' works. They're writing about ideas, and ideas live on forever. So these guys' ideas stick in the minds of what we call today our founding fathers. So when they create the Constitution, they use these guys' ideas. Now, what's really fascinating about these guys is they kind of make these ideas up like out of nowhere. Like it's never been used in practice. They just make them up. They're really good ideas. They think, but they've never been used. They die. Other people read the books like Thomas Jefferson, and they're going to try to incorporate this into our current Constitution. It is amazing to see how this has worked out in the positive over time in the United States, that these guys are crazy famous now. You'll always hear about John Locke. You'll hear about Rousseau and Montesquieu, some of the most famous people in the world, especially when it comes down to political science and how governments work. Yet when they were alive, they weren't very well known because everybody thought it was just a bunch of hooey, a lot of stuff that they were writing about. So 3 main guys you got to know here because they are going to be fundamental in the culture change in the mentality of the United States. So John Locke, he's a writer. These are all Europeans. None of these are Americans. These are Europeans. John Locke writes about the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Remember what the idea of primogeniture, all right, which basically says unless you're the oldest child, you're never going to own property or anything like that. So we will eventually reword this to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because that's really what he means. He's saying that people have a right to life, liberty, and property, meaning with primogeniture, only certain people could own property. He's like, everybody should have the equal opportunity to achieve their goals, which is owning property and being able to farm and stuff like that. So if we had left it written like that, life, liberty, and property, when we use it in America, it's really going to be confusing to people since we never used primogeniture over here in the New World. John Locke talks about the natural rights of man, that, kind of the whole men are created equal mentality. And he also says that the government's job is to protect the rights of the people. All of these guys throw out this idea that the people are there to serve the king. This is what King George, and that's the king we'll talk about for England in this unit. That's what King George believes in England, is that it is the responsibility of the colonists and anybody that's an English citizen, and the colonists were English citizens. It was a responsibility of the English citizens to serve him. John Locke and these other philosophers that come out during the Enlightenment believe that it is the government's job to protect the people and the government's job to serve the people, not the other way around. All right. So John Locke had this idea of natural rights, and that there was nobody that could take these natural rights from them, including the government or the king. All right. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Look, it looks like I'm Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I'm not. That's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. All right. So while John Locke talked about natural rights, Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed in like this concept of the social contract, which is that the government is there for the people. All right, that there is no reason for the people to serve the government. The entire point of the entire government is there to serve the will of the people as much as humanly possible. He is very much a majority rules type guy. All right. He was like, you're not going to make everybody happy, but as long as you're focusing on the majority, that's the best possible thing that you can have. That's the best outcome you can hope for. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau was really pushed for this idea that a king is useless. Go with a democracy. Not surprisingly, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, not super famous in his life. As compared to the other ones, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the most well-known while he was alive, but still didn't live any type of life of extravagance. And then Montesquieu. So Montesquieu, while John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they talk these ideological, like John Locke with natural rights and Rousseau with this concept of the social contract and majority rules, more of a democracy concept. Montesquieu, he's more your nerdy type, and he comes out like actually designs government. And man, I give him credit because this is pretty impressive. To think of this off the top of your head. He's going to talk about, all right, and while this looks boring, this is actually really, really, really cool, all right? So he is like, look, the people who run governments, they're corrupt. They just are. That's just how people are that want to be in power, that want to be politicians. They're corrupt. So let's just embrace that. Instead of trying to keep corrupt and greedy people out of government, just accept it. But here's how you keep the government from becoming corrupt, is you have 3 branches, and he's a big 3 branches guy. All right, boom, boom, boom. And he's the one that uses the legislative branch, executive branch, and judicial branch, which America will eventually take this like verbatim. That's literally what we call them in the United States today from Montesquieu's talk. And he's like, and you divide governmental power up between these 3. Each have 33% of the power, 33.3% repeating if you're a math person. They have 1/3 of the governmental power, all right? So here's what happens. If one side has a whole bunch of corrupt people in it and they start trying to gain power and gain more power in the government, what that's going to do is it's going to steal power from these other 2 branches. Well, since these other 2 branches are filled with people who also want power, they will team up and prevent that from happening. So because everybody desperately wants power in the government, and that's the type of people politicians are, if you have them compete against each other for that power all the time, none of them will ever succeed, and they will be in this stalemate, which means neither side can effectively gain power without taking it from somebody else, that they will be stuck there, and it will keep the government from getting too corrupt when you have the corrupt people keeping check and balance on the other corrupt people. So instead of saying, hey, let's not have corrupt people, he's like, put them all in there. That's cool. My system will handle corrupt people. And it's absolutely fantastic how that has worked in the United States. Doesn't mean you're not going to get crazy people in political positions of power. But if you do, since they're held in check by the other crazy political people, it'll survive. And so Montesquieu really goes through and starts talking about like the nitty gritty details. Like the other 2 guys are architects, I guess. Like they have these good ideas. And then you got Montesquieu comes in as the engineer and it's like, well, here's how this would work. So these guys that come out during the Enlightenment period really changed the way people view about government. And it's fundamentally valuable when we get to that point to create a constitution. So all these new ideas are starting to be created at the time. This is John Locke, and I really like this quote of his. He says, new opinions are always suspected and usually opposed without any other reason because they are not already common. So John Locke, this is him saying, when you come up with a new idea, even if it's a great idea, everybody's like, oh, I hate it, because they're like, different, don't like it. So John Locke, very smart person, and his idea of natural rights is a huge catalyst for the way we're going to do things. So how did the main thinkers in the Enlightenment change the way in which Americans viewed their government? We have talked about these guys quite a bit. So write 2 sentences over what their influence is going to be over how we believe in America that government should be run. And pause me if you need to. All right, the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, kind of surprisingly, is going to really tick off England. So the Great Awakening is a time period in the United States where everybody gets more Jesus. There just has, during this time period in the early 1700s, massive wave of these huge outdoor evangelical events where they go around and people get extremely religious, right? Not that we already weren't extremely religious, Puritans, Pilgrims, and all that, but this hits like a new level of people feeling like don't have enough Jesus in their life. So these revivals come out, and America becomes devoutly, intensely religious. Not that we weren't already, even more so. Here is why this is going to be really bad for England, and England's oblivious to it. All right. So yes, England's religious as well, but the evangelical mentality is talking about Jesus and the Christian religion. In the Christian religion, in the revival, they talk about equality among men, that all men are equal, that only God is superior. There is no ranking on earth. Everybody in God's eyes, probably at the time, everybody in God's eyes is just garbage. And we try to be as good as possible, try to make it into heaven, and that's it. So there's a whole big talk about equality among humans. If you're in the back of your mind, you're like, aren't these the people that own slaves? Yes, there is a ton of hypocrisy that's going to happen with people talking about equality while simultaneously owning slaves. Just go with it right now. We'll be critical of that at the right point when we get there. Otherwise, everything we say is just a hypocritical statement. But revival talks about equality and that there is no higher ranking of people on earth. Everybody's the same. Well, this ain't good for the King of England, who wants people to think he is better than everybody else, because the Americans don't view him as anything special. That there is nobody else on earth that's better than any other human. So he's just a dude. On top of that, here's a big thing, and mentally listen to this. If you lived in the colonies, you're an English citizen, just like, in theory, if you lived in England. However, the citizens in England had more rights than the people in the colonies. People in the colonies are going to have to pay taxes that the people in England don't have to. There's representation for the people that live in England. If you live in the colonies, you have no say-so in the English government. People start realizing that the colonists start realizing that the colonists themselves were not treated as equals to the other English people that just happen to live in England. That's going to really tick off the colonists. That according to their religious beliefs, everybody should be equal. However, all right, according to the laws at the time, the colonists were inferior to the citizens that lived in England. And with the Great Awakening and the belief that everybody should be equal, all right, is really going to start irritating the colonists when they realize they are not being treated equal compared to the colonists in England. And it's going to tick some people off. So the question here is, why would the concept of equality among men cause Americans to rebel from England? Like, why does them teaching about equality at these revivals actually going to cause the colonists to get salty at England? And we had talked about that right there. So pause this, get 2 sentences on it, and then we're moving on. All right, the trial of John Peter Zenger. This is cool. Individual story. And this will be the last story for today. Super cool story. So John Peter Zenger is a newspaper guy. And I believe this is in Virginia. I'm probably going to be wrong on that. For y'all, they're going to go Google this, and I'm going to make a fool of myself. But I'm going to say it's Virginia. I hope I'm not wrong, because I'm not going back and recording the whole thing again. All right, so we're going to say Virginia. The governor in Virginia is a guy named William Cosby. All right, not kind of like Bill Cosby, but not the same person. Little different time frame difference. It's William S. Cosby here, the governor of Georgia. Said governor. Governor of Virginia. So, the governor gets appointed by England. All right, so England puts the governor over here, and the governor completely just talks to England. He's supposed to run stuff. But typically the governor just shows up. You got the House of Burgesses. You got everything else going on in Virginia. He doesn't have to do anything. He's basically just the snitch that's over here. In case things go wrong, he's going to snitch on everybody over here to England. All right? So he's basically just like a spy. I think it's a very public spy. So it's a pretty cushy job. You don't have to do anything. Well, William Cosby's basically a massive sack of crap by all reports. And just to show you, this is like a portrait of William Cosby. I mean, he's just got a very punchable face, doesn't he? He just looks like he's a smug guy. All right, so William Cosby apparently just does a whole bunch of shady stuff that it's just not cool. All right, like just he like walks out of his house and like kicks people down and like punts a puppy. I don't know what he's doing, but he just does a bunch of stuff that's just mean and just garbage. Not necessarily illegal, even though I'm sure he does do illegal stuff. But he's just a garbage person, basically. Well, there's a newspaper reporter named John Peter Zenger. And so people, when they see William Cosby doing shady stuff, they tell John Peter Zenger about it. And John Peter Zenger publishes it in the paper. Just like, hey, William Cosby punted a puppy today. Why would you do so John Peter Zenger just talks trash about William Cosby in the newspaper. Well, guess who gets really upset about that? William Cosby. He's the governor of Virginia. He shouldn't, you can't talk trash about him. So they arrest John Peter Zenger for libel, which basically means at the time you can't talk trash about the government. All right. So William Cosby, all right, has John Peter Zenger arrested for talking trash about him in the newspaper. So he gets put on trial. Now, really interesting here, there is a lawyer that's going to come out and defend John Peter Zenger. He's the best lawyer around. That should be the first sign in this whole situation when the number one lawyer is going to come out and defend you for free, that maybe you've irked the colonists a little bit. But England's oblivious to this. They're like, whatever, put him on trial, throw him in jail, whatever. So Andrew Hamilton comes out and defends John Peter Zenger. Now, there is going to be another extremely famous person that we're going to talk about in the next couple units, and in this unit as well a little bit. His name is Alexander Hamilton. Super famous. They even made a Broadway musical about him, all right, called Hamilton. Andrew Hamilton and Alexander Hamilton are not related. They are commonly confused, but this is about 100 years apart. So they're not only is it not the same person, which would make the story so much cooler if it was, but they're not the same person and they're not even related. So I wish I could make that easier for you, but they're not. All right. So Andrew Hamilton comes out. At first, the entire jury that is here, which is supposed to be a jury of your peers in Virginia, are all people that are on William Cosby's payroll. All right, so here's what the trial looks like here. They're all on Cosby's payroll. Andrew Hamilton complains enough that they're like, okay, yeah, you can't have people on your payroll. That's going to be unfair. And they replace them with actual peers, people from Virginia, to see if John Peter Zenger is a criminal or not. So once the trial starts, all the people that work for Cosby stand up and confront John Peter Zenger. It's like, you said this trash about the governor, this trash about the government, this trash about, do you deny it? Do you deny it? And up one side and down the other, John Peter Zinger's like, no, I wrote every bit of that. I published every bit of that. And they're like, fine. So it seems like an open and shut case. And then Andrew Hamilton stands up and looks at the jury and he says, absolutely, he published all this stuff. But every bit of it was true. All right? He's not defaming his character if they're just talking about the stuff he's doing in public. He's punting that puppy in public. He's doing this stuff in public, in plain view of everybody. It's only actually illegal if he's lying. All right? He can say whatever he wants as long as he doesn't lie about it. And like all of Cosby's people are like, that's the dumbest argument I've ever heard. So that was the only argument that Andrew Hamilton makes. All the people get up, all the jury goes, they go, they debate. They come back in 10 minutes. And it looks like it's going to be an open and shut case. John Peter Zenger's going to jail. Nope. Say the opposite. Say he's not guilty. You can say whatever you want as long as it's not true. And goes free. This blows the mind of England's like, what? So he openly talked trash about the governor and he just gets to like go free? And the colonies collectively, they're like, yeah, it's how we do things here. Like, it's not wrong unless you're lying about it. And so libel, real early on, has a different ruling here. And this ends up being the standard bearer in American history for the freedom of press. You can put whatever you want in the paper. You can talk all the trash you want. You can't lie about it, all right? But you can put whatever you want in the paper, and you are immune from getting in trouble for that. All right, so the question here is, why was the outcome of this trial important in American history? So get 2 sentences on that, and I will see you guys tomorrow.